Inside, laughter echoed softly through rooms that once held worry. Outside, the streetlights glowed steadily. The elderly couple went to bed that night without fear. The walls felt solid. The silence felt peaceful. Their home was safe. And their story became a quiet reminder to others that sometimes the most unexpected strength comes from those who refuse to give up on the place they call home. The house stood quietly at the end of the street, just as it had for many years. Its walls were old, its paint faded, and its gate creaked when opened. But to the elderly couple inside, it was the safest place in the world. They had built their entire life around it. Every room carried memories of struggle, love, and patience. It was where they laughed, argued, cried, and grew old together. They moved into the house when they were young and full of hope. Back then, the land was empty and rough. They had very little money, but they had strong hands and strong faith. Day by day, they worked, saved, and slowly turned that land into a home. There were times when food was simple and clothes were old, but the house always came first. It was their dream, and they protected it with everything they had. Years passed. Their children were born and raised inside those walls. The house heard bedtime stories, school complaints, family prayers, and late-night worries. As time moved on, the children grew up and left to build their own lives. The house became quieter, but never empty. The couple remained, moving slowly now, but still together. Their days followed a gentle routine. Tea in the morning, sitting by the window, short walks in the yard, talking about the past. The house felt steady, like it always had, until the first letter arrived. It was slipped under the door one afternoon. The envelope looked official, heavy with printed words. The wife picked it up and placed it on the table, feeling uneasy. That night, they opened it together. The words were confusing and cold. It spoke of records, unpaid matters, and ownership questions. According to the letter, there was a problem with their home. The husband read it again and again. His heart beat faster with each line. None of it made sense. They had paid everything. They had followed the rules. This house was theirs. They tried to calm themselves. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it would pass. But more letters came. Each one sounded stronger than the last. Deadlines were mentioned. Warnings followed. Fear slowly entered their home. Sleep became difficult. Silence felt heavy. Strangers started appearing near the house. Some took pictures. Some asked questions. Some spoke politely while suggesting that it might be better to leave quietly. Every visit made the couple feel smaller in their own home. The husband went to local offices. Carrying the papers with shaking hands, the answers he received were unclear and rushed. He was told there were issues in old records. If not resolved, the house could be taken. When he returned home, tired and pale, the wife knew something was very wrong. At first, they kept it to themselves. They didn't want to worry their children, but the pressure grew too strong. One evening, the husband called one of them and explained everything slowly. Soon, the children arrived. The house filled with voices again, but this time with concern and determination. The children spread the papers on the table, reading every line carefully. What they saw troubled them. The language was confusing, and the claims felt unfair. They went together to offices, stood in lines, asked questions, and demanded clear answers. Slowly, a pattern appeared. Elderly people were being targeted. Old records were being used as weapons. Pressure was meant to force silence. The children refused to accept it. They searched through old boxes and drawers. Receipts were found. Maps were uncovered. Handwritten notes and stamps told a story the official records ignored. Still, progress was slow. The stress began affecting the husband's health. He grew weaker. The wife watched him closely, afraid that the fight might cost more than the house. That was when the children chose a different path. They shared the story. Neighbors listened. Community members came forward. Others shared similar experiences. Support grew quietly but strongly. A local reporter visited the house and listened without judgment. The story was told simply and truthfully. When it was published, It spread faster than expected. Suddenly, the silence broke. Officials became responsive. Meetings were scheduled. Records were reviewed again. The people who once pressured the couple disappeared. The house, once filled with fear, began to feel lighter. Still, the process took time. There were delays and new notices. Moments of doubt returned. But the family stayed united. Every paper was recorded. Every step was careful. The elderly couple watched their children stand strong and felt pride replace fear. Finally, the last letter arrived. The review was complete. Errors were corrected. The claims were dismissed. The house belonged fully and legally to the elderly couple. Tears fell. Breath returned. Silence became peaceful again. Life slowly returned to normal. The wife planted new flowers. The husband sat outside in the mornings. Neighbors smiled again. The house stood strong, not because it had never been challenged, but because it had been defended. The elderly couple slept peacefully once more, knowing their home, their memories, and their dignity were safe. Their story quietly reminded others that even when voices shake, truth can still stand firm. The small house stood at the edge of a quiet street, the kind of place most people passed without a second look. Its paint had faded over the years, and the wooden gate creaked when the wind pushed against it. But to the elderly couple who lived there, it was not just a house. It was their whole life. They had moved into it when they were young, full of dreams and plans, with nothing more than hope and a willingness to work hard. Every brick, every crack in the wall carried a memory. The husband woke up early every morning, as he had done for most of his life. Even though his body no longer moved as easily as before, his habits never changed. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, catching his breath, then slowly stand up. His wife usually woke a few minutes later. She moved carefully, her knees aching, but her face still soft and kind. They rarely spoke much in the mornings. They didn't need to. After so many years together, silence felt comfortable. Their days were simple. A cup of tea in the small kitchen, a short walk in the yard, a few words exchanged with neighbors passing by. The house was quiet now. Their children had grown up and moved away, building lives of their own. The rooms that once echoed with laughter, arguments, and running feet now held old furniture and photo frames. Still, the couple never felt alone. The house kept them company. They had paid for the house slowly, month by month, year by year. There were times when money was tight. Sometimes they skipped small comforts so they could make the payment on time. But they never missed one. When the final payment was made many years ago, they celebrated quietly. No party, no big announcement, just a shared smile and a feeling of relief. This place was theirs. No one could take it away, or so they believed. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was slipped under the door by someone they did not recognize. The envelope looked official, printed with words that felt heavy even before it was opened. The wife picked it up and placed it on the table, meaning to show it to her husband later. Something about it made her uneasy, but she couldn't explain why. That evening, after dinner, they opened the letter together. The words were hard to understand. There were long sentences, legal language, and numbers that didn't make sense to them. It talked about unpaid fees, land records, and ownership questions. According to the letter, there was an issue with their home. It suggested that the property might not fully belong to them. The husband read the letter twice, then a third time. His hands shook slightly. The wife watched his face, trying to read his thoughts. He didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he placed the letter down and said in a low voice that there must be some mistake. They had never received anything like this before. They had paid their taxes. They had followed the rules. How could there suddenly be a problem now, after all these years? They decided not to worry too much that night. Old people often received confusing letters, they told themselves. Maybe it was sent to the wrong house. Maybe it was a scam. They folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, hoping it would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one sounded more serious. It mentioned deadlines. It warned of possible action if the issue was not resolved. The tone was colder, less polite. Fear slowly began to replace confusion. The wife suggested calling one of their children, but the husband hesitated. He didn't want to worry them. They had their own problems, their own families to take care of. He believed he could handle it himself, so he went to the local office mentioned in the letter. It took effort. The walk was tiring, and the building was crowded. When he finally spoke to someone, the explanation he received only made things worse. The official talked quickly, using words the husband did not fully understand. He was told there were records showing issues with the land. If the matter was not cleared, the house could be claimed by others. The husband returned home, exhausted and shaken. He tried to explain what he had heard, but it all sounded confusing, even to his own ears. The wife listened quietly, her face growing pale. The house, the only place where they felt safe, suddenly felt uncertain. Soon, strangers began appearing near the property. One man walked around the house taking pictures with his phone. Another came with papers and asked questions about when they bought the place. Each visit left the couple more nervous than the last. At night, sleep became difficult. The husband lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future. The wife prayed quietly, asking for strength. They had faced many hardships in their life, but this felt different. This threat was invisible, written in papers and spoken in offices. Beyond their understanding, they stopped inviting neighbors over. They felt embarrassed, as if they had done something wrong. The wife began cleaning the house more than usual, as if holding on to it with her hands could protect it. The husband checked the gate again and again, making sure it was locked. One morning, another notice arrived. This one was clear in one painful way. It stated that if the matter was not resolved soon, further steps would be taken. The words were firm and final. That was the moment the husband realized he could not hide this any longer. That evening, he called one of their children. His voice sounded calm, but there was a sadness underneath. He explained the situation slowly, choosing his words carefully. There was silence on the other end of the line at first. Then came questions. Many questions. The child promised to look into it and said they would come soon. After the call ended, the wife wiped her eyes. She felt both relief and guilt. Relief that they were no longer alone with the problem. Guilt for not speaking up sooner. The house stood quietly that night, as it always had. But something had changed. The walls that once felt strong now felt fragile. The couple sat together in the living room, holding hands, listening to the familiar sounds of the street. They did not know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The letters, the visits, the fear, they were signs of a much bigger fight ahead. A fight they never expected to face at this stage of their lives. As the lights were turned off and the house grew dark, one truth became clear. The home they had spent a lifetime building was under threat, and whether they were ready or not, their quiet life was about to be challenged in ways they never imagined. The days after the phone call felt longer than usual. Every hour seemed to stretch, filled with waiting and worry. The elderly couple tried to continue their routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Even simple things like making tea or watering the plants felt heavy. Their minds were always somewhere else, stuck on the same thought. What if they really lost the house? The wife started noticing small changes in her husband. He spoke less. He stared at the old photo frames on the wall for longer than usual. Sometimes she caught him standing near the front door, holding the papers in his hand, reading the same lines again and again as if the words might change. Neighbors began to sense that something was wrong. A woman from across the street asked gently if everything was okay. The wife forced a smile and said yes. She didn't want pity. She didn't want rumors. Deep inside, she was afraid that if too many people knew, it would somehow make the problem more real. A few days later, one of their children arrived. The moment they stepped inside the house, they felt the tension in the air. The familiar warmth of the place was still there, but it was mixed with fear. The parents tried to act strong, offering tea and asking about the journey. But their hands shook as they poured the cups. The papers were laid out on the table. Letters, notices, and copies of old documents were spread carefully, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. The child read through everything slowly, asking questions from time to time. The parents answered as best as they could, though many details were unclear even to them. What troubled the child most was how unclear everything seemed. The letters were written in a way that confused rather than explained. They spoke of ownership issues, missing records, and unpaid amounts that didn't match any memory or receipt. It felt less like a mistake and more like something done on purpose. The next day, they went together to the local office. The building was crowded and noisy. People waited in long lines, holding files and forms. The elderly couple felt small and out of place there. The husband leaned on his child for support, both physically and emotionally. When they finally spoke to an official, the answers were cold and short. The official pointed to files on a shelf and said the records showed problems with the property. When asked for clear proof, the response was vague. The child noticed how quickly the conversation was pushed toward deadlines and consequences instead of solutions. As they walked out of the building, anger slowly replaced fear. The child realized that their parents were being treated like numbers, not people. Years of honest living meant nothing to those papers. Back at home, the family talked late into the night. The parents shared stories from the past about how they bought the land, how they saved every coin, how they raised their children in that very house. These stories were not written anywhere. They lived only in memory. And now, memory was being ignored. The child made copies of every document they could find. Old receipts were taken out of boxes. Yellowed papers were carefully unfolded. Some were so old that the ink had faded, but they were proof of effort, proof of ownership, proof of a life built slowly. In the following days, more visitors came. One man claimed he was from a development company. He spoke politely but firmly, suggesting that it would be easier for the couple to move out quietly. He said things like, "At this age, you should be comfortable somewhere else." As if the house was just a burden. The wife felt insulted. This was not just a building. This was where she cooked meals for her children, where she waited during long nights when her husband worked late, where she prayed during hard times. The thought of leaving it behind felt like losing part of herself. The husband tried to remain calm. But after the man left, he sat down heavily in his chair. His breathing was slow and uneven. The stress was beginning to affect his health. The child noticed and felt a growing sense of urgency. This situation could not continue like this. Calls were made to other family members. More children became involved. Each reacted differently. Some were angry. Some were scared. Some blamed themselves for not being there sooner. But one thing became clear. They were not going to let this go easily. They decided to seek advice outside the local office. A friend recommended someone who understood land matters. The meeting took place in a small room filled with files and dust. The explanation they received was both frightening and eye-opening. They were told that elderly homeowners were often targeted. Small errors in records, unclear boundaries, or outdated paperwork were used as tools. Pressure was applied until people gave up. Many did. Fighting back required time, patience, and unity. The parents listened quietly. The wife held her hands together tightly. The husband nodded slowly. The child felt a mix of anger and determination. This was no longer just about their family. It was about something bigger. At home, the mood shifted. Fear was still there, but it was joined by resolve. The children started organizing everything. Files were labeled. Dates were written down. Every visit, every phone call, every letter was recorded. The elderly couple watched their children work and felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the kind that ignores danger, but the kind that stands up to it. Still, the pressure did not stop. Another notice arrived, giving a final warning. The words were sharp and threatening. The husband's hands trembled as he read it, but this time he did not fold it away quietly. He handed it to his child. That evening, the family sat together. There was no panic in the room now, only serious faces and careful planning. They knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be delays, resistance, and more stress. The wife looked around the room, at the walls filled with memories, the faces of her children, now grown and standing strong. She realized that even if this fight was painful, it was also bringing them together in a way nothing else had. Outside, the street was quiet. The same sounds of distant traffic and barking dogs filled the air. To anyone passing by, it was just another ordinary night. But inside the small house, something important was happening. A family was preparing to fight back. Not with anger alone, but with patience, truth, and unity. They did not know yet how this battle would end. They did not know who exactly they were up against. But one thing was certain. They would not walk away silently. The house that had sheltered them for decades was now at the center of their lives. Once again, and this time, it was not just the elderly couple standing for it. Their children were standing beside them, ready to face whatever came next. The next few weeks were filled with movement and noise. Very different from the quiet life the elderly couple was used to. Their house, once calm and still, now saw constant activity. Children came and went. Papers were carried in and out. Phone calls rang through the rooms at all hours. The couple often sat together on the sofa, watching everything unfold. Feeling both grateful and overwhelmed, the children began by retracing the past. They wanted to understand every detail of how the house came to be theirs. Old family stories were written down carefully. The husband spoke slowly, remembering the early days when the land was just an empty plot. He talked about borrowing money, about working extra hours, about laying the foundation brick by brick. His voice sometimes broke, but he continued. These memories mattered. The wife brought out an old metal box from the cupboard. Inside were documents wrapped in cloth, protected like treasures. Receipts, handwritten notes, stamps from offices that no longer existed. The children handled them gently, as if touching history itself. Each paper told a small part of the story that the official records seemed to ignore. One child began visiting local record rooms. Dusty places filled with shelves and old files. It took patience to search through them. Some days ended with nothing found. Other days brought small victories. A matching date. A signature. A map that showed the land boundaries clearly. These moments brought hope, but also anger. Why hadn't these records been checked before sending threats? At the same time, the pressure outside continued. Another visit came from someone claiming to represent interested buyers. He spoke smoothly, offering money that sounded large but felt insulting. He suggested the couple should think about their age, about how difficult life could become if they resisted. This time, one of the children responded firmly. The conversation remained polite, but the message was clear. The house was not for sale. The visitor left with a tight smile, and for the first time, the elderly couple felt someone was truly speaking for them. Still, the stress showed its effects. The husband's health declined. He felt tired more often and complained of chest pain. The wife worried constantly, watching his every movement. The children insisted on doctor visits and rest, but rest was hard to find when fear followed them everywhere. Late one night, the wife sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the walls. She remembered teaching her children to walk there, holding their hands as they took their first steps. She wondered how anyone could look at this place and see only money. The children began to realize that private meetings and quiet paperwork might not be enough. They noticed how officials delayed responses, how letters went unanswered. It felt like waiting quietly only helped the other side. An idea slowly formed. One of the children suggested sharing the story with people outside their circle, not in anger, not with shouting, but with truth. At first, the parents were hesitant. They had lived quietly all their lives. Being noticed felt uncomfortable, but as the situation grew more serious, they agreed. Silence had not protected them so far. The children reached out to local community members. Neighbors were invited over, one by one. The story was shared carefully. People listened with concern. Some admitted they had faced similar issues or knew others who had. Slowly, support began to grow. A local community leader visited the house. They listened closely, reviewed documents, and asked thoughtful questions. They promised to look into the matter and connect the family with others who could help. For the first time in months, the elderly couple felt seen. The house was no longer just theirs. It had become a symbol of something larger, of fairness, of dignity, of the right to live peacefully after a lifetime of work. Soon, more visitors arrived, not to threaten, but to support. A retired clerk offered advice on paperwork. A neighbor helped organize files. Someone else suggested contacting a local reporter, known for covering community issues. The children discussed this carefully. They knew public attention could bring risks, but it could also bring protection. After much thought, they agreed. The reporter visited on a quiet afternoon. They sat in the living room, listening as the couple spoke. The husband's voice trembled as he explained the letters and visits. The wife wiped her eyes as she spoke of fear and confusion. The reporter took notes silently. There were no dramatic questions, only patience and respect. When the article appeared, it did not accuse or exaggerate. It simply told the truth. An elderly couple facing pressure. Unclear records. A family fighting back. The reaction was stronger than expected. People began calling. Messages of support arrived. Others shared similar stories. Some offered legal guidance. The children realized they were no longer alone in this fight. The officials who once ignored their calls suddenly became more responsive. Appointments were offered. Letters were answered. The tone changed. Those trying to claim the house grew quieter. Visits stopped. Phone calls slowed. But the family did not relax. They knew this was not over yet. The elderly couple watched all of this with mixed emotions. They were proud of their children, but also tired. The fight had taken energy they no longer had in abundance. One evening, the husband held his wife's hand and said softly that whatever happened, he was thankful. Thankful for the life they built. Thankful for the family they raised. Thankful for not standing alone. The wife smiled through tears. She reminded him that they were not done yet. The children continued pushing forward. More documents were filed. More meetings were held. Every step was careful and recorded. The house stood quietly, its walls listening to conversations about law, fairness, and memory. It had weathered storms before, and now, once again, it was being defended. The fight was becoming public. The truth was spreading. And with each passing day, the balance slowly began to shift. What started as fear was turning into strength. The elderly couple no longer sat helplessly. They sat surrounded by family and support. They still did not know how the final decision would come. But one thing was clear. The unexpected way their children chose to fight back was already making a difference. The house, once nearly silent, now felt alive again. And for the first time in a long while, hope felt stronger than fear. The attention brought new energy, but it also brought new pressure. After the story spread, the house felt watched in a different way. Not by strangers with hidden plans, but by people who cared. Support messages continued to arrive, yet the elderly couple felt the weight of what was coming next. When things become public, there is no turning back. Officials who once avoided the family now asked for meetings. Their tone was careful, almost polite. Letters arrived that sounded softer than before, filled with words like review and clarification. Children noticed the change immediately. It was clear that silence had protected the problem for a long time. Light was making it uncomfortable. Still, the process moved slowly. Meetings were scheduled weeks apart. Files were transferred from one office to another. Each step required patience. The elderly couple found the waiting harder than the threats. Waiting left too much space for worry. The husband's health remained fragile. Some mornings he struggled to get out of bed. The wife stayed close, helping him dress, reminding him to eat. The children took turns staying overnight, unwilling to leave them alone for long. Despite everything, the husband insisted on being present for every important discussion. He wanted to hear things with his own ears. He wanted to understand what people were saying about his home. During one meeting, an official finally admitted something important. There had been mistakes in old records. Boundaries were poorly marked decades ago. Some land files were updated without proper checks. It was not said loudly, but it was said clearly enough. The children exchanged glances. This was what they had been waiting for. Not an apology, not a victory, but acknowledgement. The official explained that correcting such issues took time. The family listened carefully, asking calm but firm questions. They made it clear they would not accept vague answers anymore. Outside the office, the elderly couple sat quietly on a bench. The wife held her husband's hand. It was the first time in months that the conversation had ended without threats. But just when things seemed to be improving, another challenge appeared. A new notice arrived, this one confusing and alarming. It spoke of reassessment and possible action from a different department. It felt like starting over again. The wife felt defeated. She asked how many times they would have to prove their right to live in their own home. The children felt the same frustration, but they refused to show it. They responded quickly, submitting copies of earlier acknowledgments and requesting a joint review. They kept records of every communication. Nothing was left to chance. Community support remained strong. Neighbors checked in often. Some brought food. Others simply sat and listened. The elderly couple, once private and reserved, learned to accept help. One evening, a small gathering took place in the living room. Friends, neighbors, and a few local supporters came together. There was no protest, no shouting, just quiet conversations about fairness and standing together. The husband spoke briefly. His voice was weak, but steady. He said he never imagined his home would become something people talked about. He thanked everyone for reminding him that kindness still existed. The room fell silent. Many had tears in their eyes. The next few days brought more meetings, more reviews, more waiting. The children noticed something else changing too. The people who once came to pressure the couple were gone. No more smooth talkers. No more suggestions to leave quietly. The silence from that side felt meaningful. The elderly couple slowly began to breathe easier. The wife returned to her small routines. She watered the plants again, trimmed leaves, cleaned the front step. These small actions felt like acts of hope. The husband began sitting outside in the mornings, greeting neighbors again. His smile returned slowly. Then, a long-awaited letter arrived. This one was different. It stated that the case was under final review. It confirmed that earlier claims were being questioned. It promised a decision after verification of records. The family read it together, line by line. There was no celebration yet, but there was relief. The children reminded their parents that nothing was final until it was official. Still, they allowed themselves a small moment of peace. Late that night, the elderly couple sat alone in the living room. The lights were low. The house felt familiar again. The wife said softly that she had been afraid of dying somewhere else. Not because of the place, but because this home held her life inside it. The husband squeezed her hand. He said that even if walls could not speak, they remembered the final decision was still ahead. The risk had not fully passed, but something important had already changed. The couple no longer felt small. They no longer felt invisible. They had learned that asking for help was not weakness. That standing quietly but firmly could move even heavy systems as the house settled into the silence of night. It felt stronger than before, not because of bricks or papers, but because of the people who stood for it. The story was moving toward its end. Though no one knew exactly how it would unfold, what was certain was this. The fight had reached a point where turning back was no longer possible, and whatever the final outcome, the elderly couple knew one thing for sure. They had already won something, priceless. They had been heard. The final letter arrived on a quiet morning. It came the same way the first one had, slipped under the door. For a moment, no one touched it. The elderly couple looked at each other, their faces calm but serious. They had learned that papers could change lives. One of the children picked it up and opened it slowly. Everyone waited in silence as the words were read aloud. This time, the tone was clear and steady. The review was complete. The records had been corrected. The earlier claims were dismissed. The home legally and fully belonged to the elderly couple. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Then the wife covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not from fear. The husband closed his eyes and let out a long breath he felt he had been holding for months. The children smiled, some laughing softly, some wiping their eyes. It was over. Not just the letters, not just the visits, but the constant fear that had followed them day and night. The husband stood up slowly and walked toward the front door. He opened it and looked outside. The street looked the same as it always had. Children passing by, a neighbor sweeping the sidewalk, life going on. Yet everything felt different. The wife joined him, holding his arm. She whispered that the house felt warm again. That evening, the family gathered in the living room. There was no loud celebration, no big speeches, just food shared, quiet laughter, and long conversations. The elderly couple watched their children talk and move around the house, remembering when they were small and filled. These same rooms with noise, the husband raised his cup of tea and thanked everyone. He said he never wanted to be a burden. He never wanted trouble. He only wanted peace in the place he built with his own hands. One of the children replied gently that protecting home and dignity was never a burden. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. People from the community continued to visit. Some came to congratulate them. Others came to ask questions. They wanted advice. They wanted to know how to protect their own homes. The elderly couple listened quietly as their children shared what they had learned. About records, about standing firm, about not staying silent when something feels wrong. The house became a place of guidance, not fear. The husband's health slowly improved. With the stress lifted, he slept better. His appetite returned. He started taking short walks again, greeting neighbors with a smile. The wife returned fully to her routines. She planted new flowers in the yard, choosing bright colors. She said the house deserved something new after everything it had been through. One afternoon, she stood by the window and watched sunlight fall across the floor. She remembered the night she had feared losing everything. She realized now that what saved them was not strength alone, but togetherness. The children returned to their own lives, but the bond between them felt stronger than ever. They called often. They visited more. The house was no longer just their parents' home. It was a reminder of who they were as a family. A few weeks later, a short follow-up appeared in the local news. It stated that the case had been resolved and records corrected. No drama, just facts. But for those who knew the story, it meant justice. The elderly couple kept a copy of that notice in the same drawer where the first threatening letter once lay. Not to remember fear, but to remember victory. One evening, the husband sat on the front step as the sun set. The wife sat beside him. He said quietly that he once believed homes were made only of walls and roofs. Now he knew better. Homes were made of memory, of sacrifice, of people willing to stand up when it mattered. The wife nodded. She said that even when they felt powerless, they were never truly weak. They had their children. They had their community. They had truth as night fell. The house stood strong, not because it had never been challenged, but because it had survived